why we decided to build BeeAI. It's evolved a lot since the start of the project. It focuses mainly now on building agents that are ready for production, right? So we have found our differentiator in building abstractions of things like caching, memory, observability, and most importantly, the ability to enforce rules to guide agent behavior. Because without the ability to control agent behavior, it's up to the model's reasoning ability to decide what tools to call, how to call them, and how to get the job done. And so that's the differentiator we have gone after is how can we make the simplest to implement framework that is the most holistic in terms of giving developers the ability to plug in all of the components they need to create a production-ready agent they can control.
Welcome to ODSC's Ai X Podcast, your gateway to the latest in AI and data science. Whether you're an aspiring data scientist or a seasoned AI professional, we bring you insights from the best minds in the field, shaping the future of AI. This episode is sponsored by ODSC West, the premier AI Builders Conference celebrating its 10th year this October 28th to 30th in San Francisco and virtually. Learn more at odsc.com/California and use the code PODCAST for an exclusive 10% discount. Sheamus McGovern, the founder of ODSC, will be your host today.
In this episode, we're exploring what it really takes to build reliable AI agents you can trust, not just in prototypes, but in production. From hard-coded rules and observability to agent communication protocols and payment flows. We'll unpack it all with IBM's Sandi Besen. So whether you're an engineer, founder, or just curious about where AI agents are headed, this conversation has something for you. Sandi, delighted to have you. You were an MC at ODSC East here in Boston. It seems like a lifetime ago, but that was only in May, and you're going to be joining us again for ODSC AI West. But before we talk all about that, Sandi, would love if you could introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your current role at IBM working on open source AI agents.
Hey everybody, I'm Sandi Besen. I'm currently an AI engineer and ecosystem lead at IBM Research. And I'm part of the product incubation team. We take a lot of the research that's coming out of IBM's labs. We take research from other places as well, read them, and we incubate new exciting products that are really on the forefront or that bleeding edge. So most recently, we've been working with BeeAI, an agent framework and platform, which we can talk about later, advocating for it, trying to get adoption for it. And that's a little bit about what I've currently been doing, but before my career in STEM, I was actually in the performing arts. So I did a whole 180 spin on a stage, but in a very different way than I used to be.
So let's get right into it. We all know there's a growing interest in agent frameworks. And even though some have been around for a long time, LangChain, Llama Index, Crow AI, for the most part, a lot of them are still early stage. Can you talk a little bit about what inspired the creation of BeeAI and what specific problems are you and the team aiming to solve with BeeAI?
Yeah. So you referred to what I like to say is agent madness or agent chaos. And essentially what started the need for BeeAI, because like every good product begins with a need, right? There's something you're trying to do that doesn't exist in the market today in an easy open source way to do it, right? And so us trying to build agents, we came across some barriers when we were using the other open source frameworks out there. Like we use Crew AI heavily at IBM Research, but came across some barriers in terms of how flexible we could make those agents. Same thing with LangChain and LangGraph, the complexity that was required to make those agents, and realized that we would like to create something in the middle, something that gives the developer the control they need to actually create very detailed and intricate agent, but add an abstraction where it's not so complex that it takes forever to upskill. That's where the framework piece came in. And then on the platform side, we realized that now we have these agents. Now, what do we do with them? Do we have to build custom applications every time we create a new agent? That is one, very cumbersome, two, high maintenance, and requires a skill set of a certain type of person, right? And so we were like, how can we make that easier? Once you have these agents, how can you share them with others? How can you get feedback and test them and share them with non-technical users without having to create this whole custom application.
Yeah, that's so interesting because, as you mentioned, these frameworks have been around a couple of years. We use a lot of these frameworks as well. But what we've noticed in the last year or so, is it fair to say that when Anthropic released MCP back in November of last year, that kind of started this new wave of agent to agent protocols? So a lot of great frameworks out there, but they couldn't communicate with each other. Now we have MCP, Model Context Protocol, is getting a lot of traction, as is A2A. We covered MCP a lot in this podcast, not so much A2A. And then, of course, there's other frameworks that just have been announced. Yeah, would love if, Sandi, just by way of background, if you could tell people a little bit about these other frameworks that have come out.
Yeah, I love this conversation because I think it's something that often gets overlooked. These terms are so popular that we just start building in them and digging into them. But a lot of the times we miss the fundamental understanding of how they're different and when each of them should be used. I think that first before getting into my own opinion. I always think of MCP like a vertical connection. You have the language model, and then you have a vertical connection to your tools, your resources like documents and prompts and other things like that. What MCP does is it standardizes the input and output between the tool calls or the resource calls and the language model itself. So I think of it like this vertical diagram where you have this horizontal piece. That's how I like to think of it. You're not standardizing the call between the tools or resources in the language model, but between one agent that can use MCP and another agent. So it's like this horizontal bar, right? So when I think of MCP driving agent adoption, I think it's not because it allows it to do anything different. It doesn't allow it to do anything that it couldn't before. All it allows it to do now is standardize the way it's done. Developers themselves don't have to build from scratch every time.
Yeah, I love the way you described MCP as vertical and A2A as horizontal. I may have to steal that, Sandi, because
Please do share.
my description is usually a little more long-winded, as these listeners well know. I like that. And again, we all complain about the speed of AI, and speed itself has become the challenge. The latest protocols that have come out are focused on payments,
Yes, that is a new hot topic.
getting agents to collect money.
I think that naturally, when we get to the evolution where enough people learn how to build things, people then want to monetize them, right? That's the
Yeah.
next thing to do. Allowing monetization, not just from major companies that can insert them into products, but by individuals or community developers can also monetize their work, I think is really powerful. A good application of these new payment protocols. There's specifically two payment protocols that have come out in the last couple of weeks. One is AP2 by Google, and they are a payment protocol that standardizes payments. I think they're partnering with Stripe. I don't want to misspeak, but I think they're partnering with Stripe. And there's Agent Commerce Protocol by OpenAI that was announced this week. So things are moving fast, right? Whenever one protocol comes out, there has to be a competing protocol until you have convergence. OpenAI has announced that they are including this protocol in some of their new features that they're going to roll out, like purchasing products on ChatGPT itself.
That's so interesting because when we talk about agents in enterprise and going from the pilot stage to production, there has been a series of blockers. Like, would you trust an agent to buy something for you on the web, or would you trust an agent with your money? And it's so interesting. Like, I think the killer app for agents, we're actually coding agents, right? Look at Lovable and Bolt and the revenue they're generating. And it's going to be interesting to see if payments is going to be the next one, because that is one of the core components for a lot of companies, building that trust and building these open payment protocols. And I think it looks like they're being rolled out to Stripe and a bunch of other payment systems as well. That leads to my next question. Enterprises are talking about moving those agent projects into production, and ROI, companies are looking for some ROI because most companies are now 2 years into this AI journey, LLM journey. First it was large language models and fine tuning. Now it's agents. Everyone is still talking about the MIT paper that came out. I'm remiss in the title.
Exactly.
95% of all companies did not find a good return of investment or ROI on generative AI. Do you see differentiating factors that will decide which frameworks gain wide adoption and what are the inevitable trade-offs? If we can solve more of those problems for these enterprises, like any enterprise trying to build out its own payment system with issues around guardrails, had a huge hill to climb there.
Absolutely. I think there are a few. And I'll start with my slightly sarcastic point of view, which is money. How
Yeah.
much you have and how much marketing budget do you have? Because if the goal is adoption, a lot of the time it's the framing, it's the story. Of course, the product needs to be solid and good, but that is a huge part of it. And the second is actual product differentiation. I talked a little bit in the intro about why we decided to build BeeAI. It's evolved a lot since the start of the project. It focuses mainly now on building agents that are ready for production, right? So we have found our differentiator in building abstractions of things like caching, memory, observability, and most importantly, the ability to enforce rules to guide agent behavior. Because without the ability to control agent behavior, it's up to the model's reasoning ability to decide what tools to call, how to call them, and how to get the job done. And so that's the differentiator we have gone after is how can we make the simplest to implement framework that is the most holistic in terms of giving developers the ability to plug in all of the components they need to create a production ready agent they can control, right? Other frameworks like Crew AI have gone for ease of use. So they have a lot of stuff very highly abstracted, makes it very easy to create an agent. Slightly harder to go deeper down into the intricacies in change agent implementation. Then you have the opposite end of the spectrum where you have LameGraph, where it's exceptionally detailed and you have to build a lot of the stuff that the framework provides the components of, but doesn't actually provide abstractions of. And so we try to sit somewhere in the middle where we're like, want to give you the control to control the behavior of your agent, but we want to make it so that you have a lot of these components built in that you don't have to build from scratch.
Yeah, that's cool. By the way, just before we started recording, Sandy, I was looking at the open source repo on GitHub for BeeAI. A lot of great info there. It is very interesting. I was quite interested in what you just mentioned, rules.
So I just refer to them as rules. In the framework, they're actually called conditional requirements, but you can
Yeah,
just refer to
conditional.
them as rules, right? Rules that we put on the agent that they must follow, and they don't have the choice because the framework enforces them. It's not up to the LM's ability to decide.
Yeah, and to me it was key because we've had some other guests in this podcast talking about security around LLMs in general and AI agents by association. And I also follow another previous podcast guest, Dan Hendricks, who writes a lot about security issues around AI. He and other folks have mentioned the issues around these agents. And actually, I think it was Anthropic did some research where LLMs have this capacity, even though you give them system prompts and suggest they not do something, they can still go ahead and do it. And even Jan LaCuna said it's very important that LLMs print what they're thinking because they cannot be a black box. I really like this idea that you guys came up with in BeeAI around this conditional requirements are the way would I be correct in describing them almost like a coded rules and constraints into the agent system? We had a roundtable at East, which you were at, and I spoke to pretty much everyone we invited to the roundtable. The one word I kept on hearing was trust. It makes a lot of sense to me to instead of doing prompt only systems like suggesting certain behavior, to apply these hard coded rules and constraints from a compliance standpoint, from a business logic or business rule standpoint. Right?
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. And that's the reason why we decided to build this framework out is because of hearing this feedback and trying ourselves to put agents into production and not having them be reliable for actual scaled use. We can't put something into production. There's a famous mistake or use case that came out when a car company accidentally sold a car for $1 because they were using their
I could do with a car for $1. I think.
and that's something that scars a company from wanting to implement these things and also heeds a warning to the rest of the industry around the things that can go wrong. And that's like a pretty benign thing that went wrong. And so we heard this, we experienced this, right? And that's why we built the conditional requirements into the framework through the requirement agent, where essentially what it does behind the scenes is you can put certain parameters on tools. For instance, if I'm calling the internet search, I can say that this tool is only allowed to be used up to 3 times, and it must be used after this other tool, and it can't be called consecutive times in a row. I can implement all of my custom business logic on how this tool is enforced. And then when it comes time to actually the LLM to call a tool, the LLM is only exposed to tools it is allowed to call based on the logic you have provided. It doesn't even see tools it's not allowed to call, so it doesn't get the option to call them. We act as that middleware, providing enforcement of rules because we're not leaving it up to the LLM to decide. It's the framework's role to guide the agent behavior.
Yeah, and I think this is so clutch because I don't think you're limiting the agents by doing that, because it kind of freaked me out a little bit because we print out the logs to see what the agent is doing and we give it so many tools to choose from. And now, of course, MCP servers as well. And the agent's going through and we're trying to check if it's selected the right tool. Sometimes they'll ignore it and it'll decide, well, I'm not going to use the tool. I'm going to use my own knowledge to do this. It won't select the right tool.
It also prevents against is, for instance, if you decide that, hey, the GPT-5 has gotten really expensive and I want to switch models, but to something that is slightly smaller and less expensive, or even start running something locally on a smaller model, you're then dependent on the reasoning ability of the model itself to make good decisions around how to call tools and complete tasks. Now we've taken that away. So
Yeah.
you can use much smaller models to do bigger tasks, for instance, because you're
Trust them
giving
more.
it less choice.
Yeah.
It's requiring less reasoning ability on the LLM itself.
Yeah, and I haven't got a chance to try BeeAI myself, but it's definitely on my list because I was looking at the open source and the README. I do like the constraints, as you mentioned. You can put in a list of allowable tools for certain agents, and then the actions as well. Obviously, you can deny actions. I definitely had an incident where we gave a database action and it tried to delete something because it was trying to be helpful and fix something. But now I like the fact you can just say deny action, such as a delete or an insert or an update or something like that's cool. Or insert is okay, but update is not. So I think that's very powerful. I think definitely adding more deterministic behavior to a non-deterministic agent is the right move. I'd like to see more companies kind of
Yeah.
take advantage of this.
Or like you said in your example, you can only update once you have called the human validation tool that requires approval from the human or not, right?
Yeah.
And you don't have to actually, we wrote a blog post a couple weeks ago that is around the requirement agent and what it enables you to do. And we wrote the same agent using LangGraph, which I'm a huge fan of. I think LangGraph is a great framework. But the amount of code difference that it took us to build the same thing out was like, it took 5 times less code to build it in BeeAI than it did in LangGraph because I didn't have to build all of the orchestration logic to make that happen. I just had to set the requirement.
Nice. And it's so relevant because you mentioned the car for $1. I heard a couple of weeks ago, someone was on the chat agent, some huge airline, but they managed to coax the agent to sell lifetime airline travel for the price of one ticket. And there was a court case and the judge ruled in favor of the purchaser of the ticket, saying you have to honor that sale because you bought it. So it's lifetime travel. And we can see a lot of people are talking about rogue agents. Was it Noma Security, if I pronounced the first name correctly? They just raised 100 million to not only monitor agents, but prevent this rogue agent behavior. I think BeeAI has a pretty good solution for that. What about the agent reliability as opposed to rogue agents? Is that something that you guys think about?
The reliability stems from enforcing rules or behavior on the agent, because if you don't allow it to do certain things, it cannot. We also focus a lot on observability, tracing and trajectory. So like you mentioned, the chain of thought where you can actually print out what the agent is thinking. We focus on bringing that into our platform side. Moving on from the framework where you build the thing, how do you then show it to the user? How do you demonstrate to the user that this is a trustworthy agent? We have a lot of components in the platform that show what tools the agent has access to,
Yeah.
a description of the agent, the chain of thought, or what's actually happening behind the scenes in the agent, the resources that it used, or if it got any internet sources, citation, things like that. So these are all things we try to build in.
Sure.
You can build in to your platform agent if you'd like, just by using basically some metadata in your code.
How do people get started with using BeeAI to build their own agents?
I think there's 2 steps as we talked about the framework and the platform. First, experiment with the framework. Build your agent first, right? Build something that includes caching, observability, and rules for the requirement agent. Build something that feels production ready with the components on the framework. Then bring it into the platform. We have an SDK that makes it very easy. The platform runs on A to A. The underlying protocol is A to A. So you can bring any A to A agent into the platform. It doesn't matter whether that's built in BeeAI, LangGraph, Crew AI. We have agents from all frameworks running on the platform. And that's the beauty of open source, right? And protocols is you can standardize things to bring them into one place. So bring your agent, whether it is the one you build in BeeAI or one you've already built, into the platform, and then share that with an end user. You can get feedback on your agent. You can test it using a UI. We have components like forms or events that can trigger things. It doesn't need to be a chat interface. As the world starts moving away from the chat interface, we're also enabling different ways that you can interact with your agent and share it with others. If you're not sharing it with an end user that is also technical, then no one wants a script. Don't send me your agent as a script. How am I supposed to run that? Send me something that I could actually use as a user.
Yeah, and what I like too is you mentioned earlier about the observability is built in. What are you guys using for that behind the scenes? Is that open telemetry or is it some other protocol?
Open telemetry. Yeah. So we use
Yeah.
open telemetry to capture all the trace.
What you just mentioned is so important because time to value is a big deal in AI prototyping. So, given what you said, how long do you think it'll take someone new to using this framework to go from zero to deploying an agent with AI?
I think that if you have already built your agent, we'll take the building out of it. If you've already built your agent and you want to bring it into the platform, as a new user who's also learning the platform and upskilling, maybe it will take you about an hour. Just because you're learning the platform, you're
Yeah.
installing it, you're getting it up running locally. Maybe it'll take you about an hour end to end to get your agent running, which is honestly not bad because if you were to create a UI by yourself, that would take you way longer than an hour, even if you're vibe coding it, because you need to go back and do iterations and make sure you have the back end set up. People think it's just a front end, but really there's a whole back end piece too,
Right.
right? And so we provide all that for you. Once you're already a user and you know how to work with the platform, it might take you 15 minutes to get your agent from a script that you've built to a interface that you can use.
Oh, very cool. And do you mind if we switch to talking about startups? Because I know you advise some
Yeah.
startups as well. And it's always interesting because even for our listeners who are not in startups or thinking of starting one, there's always some good lessons there. I think projects and startups have a lot in common. We know startups, like a lot of project teams, have to make trade-offs early, right? Are there any common mistakes or missteps that you see early stage AI companies make when they try and build agents or incorporate them into the core offering?
Yeah. I think especially in the last couple of years, it's been exceptionally hot to take the newest possible technology and apply it to everything. I'm not saying that's the wrong move necessarily. I'm just saying that that isn't really an approach to starting any successful company. Approach to starting a successful company is either it's on two ends, right? Right? Like either building something that is actually net new, right? So you're building something that has new technology implemented in it, and you are the lab or the person creating that technology, or you're on the application side. And if you're on the application side, which like probably 99% of companies are, then implementing the absolute newest technology has some major advantages if you fundamentally understand the limitations of the technology. And I think that's where most people go awry is that they'll implement the absolute newest technology without fundamental understanding of where the technology breaks down. They haven't tried to break it yet. They haven't done their own red teaming, right? And so they're building something that is extremely brittle or doesn't work most of the time. And yes, it might use AI agents, it might use the newest technology, but is it ready for that specific use case?
Yeah, 100%. I've come across that challenge quite a few times with the frameworks. We've seen ourselves use frameworks that'll get us quite far, and all of a sudden we'll hit a bottleneck because there is always a choice between building something custom versus using those frameworks, right? So, how do you counsel folks on when to build an agent system from scratch versus extending or using a framework like BeeAI or one of the other frameworks? It's always a tough question.
If there is something that a framework cannot do that you need, you have the choice of forking that repo if it's open source and extending it, or building from scratch if there's a reason you need to do that. But I'm always a proponent of why reinvent the wheel when it already exists. Now, I think that there are two things. You mentioned something earlier that I want to come back to, being a little bit too early on something. I think that's a
Yeah.
really interesting topic, right? Especially right now when things are changing so quickly. There's kind of two approaches you can take. You can either decide, I'm going to build it anyways, and it might not be that good right now, but because of how quickly things are getting better, things are going to get better to the rate where it'll catch up. And by the time I'm done building it, it'll be good enough, right? And you're taking that gamble and you're taking that bet and you're crossing your fingers. Or there's the other approach where you're like, hey, this isn't ready yet. So we're not going to build to it yet. We're going to build to the technology that we know is functional and reliable. And then we're going to iterate and increase it, make it more cutting edge as that technology becomes more reliable. So there's two approaches and totally depends on the founders, what their ethos is, how much money they have, how quickly they need to the types of things they're building, stuff like that. But
Yeah.
I want
No,
to come back to that because it's interesting and it's a choice that founders have to make. Do we use cutting edge and hope that it catches up, or do we build to what's reliable today?
no, I think that's excellent advice. I've seen companies take both approaches. The one caveat I would add to it, I think they generally look at what's the user profile and is this a low risk application versus a high risk application. The low risk applications, you can start building this out and then it still might not be perfect, but better to stake a claim on this problem, get it fixed, deliver some value and get it out there, as you mentioned before. There's other aspects that can lead to unpredictable behavior. So when you're advising teams and startups and others about safety testing, validation of agents early on, what do you think is the must have for a team?
There's a few key pieces that should be, in my opinion, in any agentic system that performs real tasks. One is human validation, especially if you're doing something like sending an email, updating a database, processing a payment, anything that affects the end user in a way that could be impactful for them, it still needs to have human validation at this point in time. That might change in the near future. You mentioned guardrails and safety checks, right? That's necessary to build into your solution. A good example of this is, let's say that you want to host a chatbot for your car dealership, right? Sally in the second grade finds your chatbot at your car dealership website and starts doing her math homework with your chatbot. If
Yeah.
there's no guardrail that says you cannot, and not just in the prompt that suggests the agent should not answer the question, but something that catches this and classifies it as allowed or not allowed, and either decides to pass it to the agent or not pass it to the agent, then you're overlooking something very pivotal, right? And that's a very safe example. There's very unsafe examples as well. So, talking about things like safety checks, content safety, prompt injections, uh, PII, and harmful information from a company's systems, things like that, right? You need to protect yourself against all these things by using different guardrails. There's some good open source ones out there. There's also some good products out there. But with these frameworks, it's not hard to use this in your system, right? You can call this before something actually gets passed to the LLM.
Yeah, very cool and very good advice. So, with things changing so fast, a question I get all the time, if you were founding an AI agent startup today, where would you focus your initial efforts?
That's such a good question. And can I ask you a question back? Where would I suggest others focus, or where would I
Yeah.
focus?
Where would I focus? I think I give a different answer every time.
And I think that's fair because it depends on what your current interests are, what's happening in the market shifts, things like that.
Just listen to you, for example. I think one thing I'm starting to roll back on is I think I've sometimes been too aggressive on the latest technologies. Some of this stuff needs a little time to mature. Do love the fact that systems like BeeAI are coming out, which have these more rules-based systems. That's where a lot of startups, the wheels start to come off the bus. You can do so much with LLMs and agentic AI, but once you go to the buyer, get past the demonstration of magic and the excitement, like, okay, well, you want me to write you a check, but how am I going to trust this thing, especially for a small startup? Trust is huge.
Absolutely. How do we blend these two things, right? How do we blend the reliability and rule-based systems that we already know and are comfortable with and we know work with the cutting edge of LLMs. As you were saying that, I was thinking, personally, if you asked me that question, I would stay on the new technology side because I've realized that's where I'm most passionate. I like working with the latest things. I like being part of pushing the boundary, and I'm comfortable with the fact that it doesn't always work. But if I'm, depends on what I'm building, right? So if I'm building then product, then I don't know if I would have that same answer because it needs to work for your customer because unhappy customers don't get
That's right.
adoption and then you don't raise money and you're not successful. So I think in the place that I'm in right now, I'm interested in the next frontier, next evolution stuff. But if I decide one day to start something, I might have a different answer when it comes to the practicality.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And the go-to market is so interesting because it's so noisy out there right now with so much going on. And as you mentioned, and actually, I didn't know much about those protocols. Google P2 and Stripe and OpenAI, that's just open up a whole ton of go-to market strategies. It'll be interesting to see if that actually takes the risk out. Because protocols at the end of the day, they don't de-risk anything. Actually, sometimes they can make things more risky.
Yeah, I guess if you hack the standard and everything's a standard, I can see that point as well, right? But I think you touched on something interesting there as we wrap up. These next generation of protocols will unleash a lot of market potential, but the fundamental there is they're not going to be effective unless we can solve the trust problem and the reliability problem. Because who is going to build that into their solution if they cannot trust their agent uses it effectively?
Yeah, absolutely. I love these long-running agents now, like computer use from OpenAI and the other one from Claude. A lot of times, as you mentioned, the reliability is not there. They can do some really interesting and cool work, but using it for tasks that I need done frequently and reliability is something else. But they will get better, as you mentioned. Things are getting better. One of my last few questions is, what do you sense is coming out short to medium term? What do you see in agents emerging in the next 3 to 6 months?
Context engineering is having its moment.
Big topic at West.
I think it will continue, at least for the next couple months, to have its moment. What's surprising to me is that this isn't a new topic. This is something that has existed since we started building agents, but there's a focus that's been put on it. And I don't know what triggered that focus, but I think it's good. I think it's a good idea that focus has been put on it because it is true that the better the context you provide to the LLM, the better the output of the LLM, right? So that's one thing that I think will continue in the next couple months to have its moment. Second, there's a lot of focus emerging on memory, specifically long-term memory and storing memories, whether it's user-specific memories for personalization or organizational level memories for how an organization operates. That feeds into context engineering. They're kind of separate but converging topics. As we get further along in the context engineering hype cycle, memory will be the next part of that. We've done everything we can with understanding retrieval and searching from the internet and different sources using MCP tools. But now, how do we actually manage the difference as agents become more enterprise ready and they're more instantiated in the processes and workflows? How do we actually manage these memories, these long-term versus short-term versus individual versus company-wide memories?
Yes, Sandy, I think it's my turn to say that you hit the nail on the head there. Those are two very hot topics. Everyone knows about context engineering, but we found memory to be extremely challenging, like massively challenging, because it's just getting so complicated so quickly, especially in these multi-agent systems. So I can tell you've been deep in the weeds of these agent frameworks because anyone who's actually worked in multi-agent AI systems, I think that comes back to be a major issue. You mentioned some good examples of memory I haven't thought of there, but there's so many diverse memory types and they keep popping up, different requirements. And now we're looking at assisted, shared, dynamic memory. And then, of course, the cost of this memory. No free lunch in this business.
It's something I've been thinking about a lot over the last year because, like you said, if you've been knee deep in building these things out since they started emerging, which was maybe 2 years ago now, like this has been a problem since the beginning. But we're just getting to the point in the evolution of the technology where we can start to focus on these problems because some of the more foundational problems have been solved. I'm excited for this next chapter where we focus on the components that make an agentic system better because we've solved a lot of the root issue.
No, I agree with you 100%. Sandi, give us a hot take for this week.
Okay. My hot take that I talked about today was on the change of consulting because of AI. I came from a consulting world, have a consulting
Interesting.
background. I think consulting is going to go through a major evolution in the next year to 2 years.
Yeah, I can see that. Google Deep Research is my consultant these days. Okay,
Yeah.
I'll take that as a hot take. And Sandi, thank you so much, because we've actually had a lot of podcasts on agentic AI and AI agents over the last 3 months. To our listeners, I know they're going to find a lot of value in this. This has been an education for me, and BeeAI, I think, is a pretty cool open source platform. So kudos to you and the team over there for making it open source. I would encourage people to check it out.
Thank you, Sheamus, for being a thought partner, and the ODSC team for being so awesome. I'm looking forward to ODSC West.
And how do people follow your work, Sandi? I'll include all this in the show notes. You mentioned the blog site.
I have a Medium blog, but I post quite regularly on LinkedIn, and that's a main source. If you're interested in workshops that I'm running or my random spicy takes on what's happening in the industry, and if you want to follow the project, the best place to do that is one, starring us on GitHub. Not only shows support, but also tells you when new features arise. We have a community call every month. If you're interested in joining the community, please join our community call. We talk about updates to the platform. We also highlight projects that are community built. So if you're building with BeeAI and want to be highlighted, we'd love to post that in our Discord channels, and I'll share that with our community.
Oh, that's fantastic. I have not heard of that before. A community call. I think that's a fantastic idea. Well, Sandi,
Yeah.
thank you so much. We
Thanks for having
appreciate your time, and I'll see you at ODSC West in a few short weeks at this point.
Sounds good. See you there.
Bye for now.
Your engagement directly contributes to the growth and success of our community. Please subscribe now and don't miss out on the next enlightening episode. This episode is sponsored by ODSC Ai West, the premier AI Builders Conference celebrating its 10th year this October 28th to 30th in San Francisco and virtually. Learn more at ODSC AI and use the code PODCAST for an exclusive 10% discount. Supporting our podcast by subscribing not only helps our small dedicated team at ODSC, but also unlocks exclusive benefits for you.